Now moving on to our second panel to speak with business representatives, and so we will be welcoming to the committee Dhara Vyas, Director of Advocacy and Programmes at Energy UK. On the screen we'll hopefully see Dave Dalton, who is the Chair of the Energy Intensive Users Group and also the Chief Executive of British Gas. There is Dave. Hello, Dave. And in the room as well, we've got Karen Betts, CEO of the Food and Drink Federation, and Tina McKenzie, UK Policy and Advocacy Chair from the Federation for Small Businesses. So hopefully you'll find your spots, and there should be some clean cups and water there. Great. If everyone's comfortable, we will kick off. There we are. So Dhara Vyas, I'm just going to come to you first. There's been some reporting this morning, a bit more detail of what we might expect from the new administration this week on support on energy bills. It's been reported that for households, the government will set the price, not Ofgem, and then they'll pay energy companies the difference. But the cost of that will be recouped by a levy on bills over a period of time. It sounds as if the windfall tax isn't being extended and energy companies are getting a load of money paid for by bill payers. I mean, your members are doing quite well out of that, aren't they?
I think I haven't seen the detail of what's been announced, and it's not a formal announcement. That's my understanding, that it's speculation and leaks to the media. So it's difficult to comment on those sorts of details. So I think generally speaking, you know, we are facing a really, really critical winter, as you've heard from your first panel, and the most important thing is to make sure that there is support for people, support for households and support for businesses this winter. One of the things we have called for is a deficit tariff scheme, which is, you know, sort of in the ballpark of what you're talking about. But I think with some key differences in that this shouldn't be the only thing, and there has to be the detail has to be worked through to make sure that we get out of it. It's not an enduring solution, and it's not a long-term solution. However, prices this winter are far higher than anyone had anticipated. It is being driven by global gas prices, as you know, and as the committee knows. And it's really important that people get the help they need and businesses get the help they need this winter, whilst the incoming government, the new government, work with industry, work with the regulator and work with consumer bodies to put in place exit plans from any sort of deficit tariff scheme, and also consider two things. One is how we could perhaps move to a voluntary CFD where we, you know, take people who are on the existing renewable obligation scheme, which pays a subsidy on top of wholesale prices, into a more a CFD, which is a significant first step, I think, to achieving that decoupling of gas and electricity prices, but it isn't rushing into anything, because the reality is that the electricity market reform that we need is complex and should be long-term and should be sustainable. So I do think it's important that we consider what a voluntary CFD would do, because it would give generators more certainty on prices and it would also pay back. And I don't think it could be done for this winter. So to your first point, I definitely think we need more urgent help for this winter. But what we could be doing is thinking about moving to a voluntary CFD scheme, which would start paying back from next winter, and it could save between £150 to £250 per household, and it could save between £6 and £11 billion for non-dom customers, so business customers. So, in summary, yes, we need urgent help for this winter, but it mustn't just be a sticking plaster, nor should it be an enduring solution. We need to be working through the details.
And so if the help that's offered to bill payers is essentially a loan, which is then repaid via energy bills, do your members support that?
The vast majority of our members are in favour of anything that will help people this winter. We're also really aware that we do need to target extra help and support to certain customers who need it the most. Talking about paying it back over a longer period of time, this is about the fact that there is really, really high global gas prices. Most energy suppliers aren't making huge profits. In fact, most haven't made profits since...
Energy generators are, though, aren't they?
And yeah, well, suppliers aren't. And there are certainly parts of the industry that are making money. And this is a trade-off for the government to consider what the impact is for the long-term investment horizon. the energy generators and renewable investment in renewable energy, I should say, it's worth about £100 billion over this coming decade. And there's a question about how important it is that we are investing in clean, homegrown, domestic, renewable generation in order to end our dependency on importing gas, invest in net zero, and crucially, move us to a more sustainable, smart, renewable grid.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to come to other guests now, just about what's happening with your member organisations in the bodies that you represent. So Karen Betts first from the Food and Drink Federation. We were hearing on the previous panel, it's going to be a very difficult winter ahead for people spending disposable income, and for a lot of people even just being able to put food on the table to feed themselves.
I think it is going to be a really difficult winter. I mean, you've seen a fairly rapid rise in the rate of food and drink inflation over the summer. Food and drink inflation now stands at 12.7%. So, our industry feels caught in the eye of a pretty powerful storm at the moment. We know that we have a huge responsibility to keep prices affordable. But all of our manufacturing companies are experiencing exponential rises in their inputs. So whether that's the cost of ingredients, the cost of energy, the cost of raw materials, the costs of transport, the costs of labour, all of those costs are really going up. Companies are doing everything they can to cut costs. So you'll see advertising and marketing budgets slashed. You'll see in some cases product lines being rationalised, but there are limits to all of that. Companies have to remain viable, obviously, and so some costs are being passed on. And I think, as we go through the winter, we will see how it goes, but different businesses will be impacted in different ways, and some businesses may not make it through. The energy issues in particular are very hard for companies. Many of our companies were on fixed energy rates. Those that were are coming off them at the moment. And in general, what we hear from our members is that it is impossible to fix going forward at an affordable price. So the prices they are being offered for energy contracts, if you're fixing for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years out, are exponentially higher than they were. So most companies are going on to a daily rate. And that's making their lives pretty volatile and managing the way in which they manage their costs, the way in which they manage their prices, and conversations with retailers and customers about prices has become very difficult. I think there are particular issues in our sector about SMEs. You will know that our sector has a massive range of companies within it, real range of sizes. But there is a real criticality within the supply chain of many of our SMEs. So I think many of our larger companies are worried about some of the SMEs in their supply chain. Obviously, those SMEs are worried about their own businesses. And this is about being able to pay essentially for these rising costs, but particularly in energy. We have some energy-intensive users in our industry, so flour millers, coffee roasters, bakeries. There are some parts of the industry that are more affected than others by very high prices. We've got parts of our industry that use carbon dioxide as an input, and you'll have seen that there is real tightness in the CO2 market and a real question about the resilience of that market. We've had that question of resilience for more than a year now, and whilst some work has been done by the government and by companies to introduce more resilience into the system is still pretty precarious, and that will feed into price rises and potentially into the operationality of some companies. So it is a worrying time, I think, both for households in terms of food and drink price inflation arriving on their doorsteps at the same time as obviously the energy price rises that you've just been discussing, and it's a worrying time for businesses about being able to maintain that viability that I referred to off the back of a successive series of crises that have eroded the resilience of businesses in our sector, and ensuring that they can make their way through the current period and find their way out of the other side.
If there are small or medium-sized businesses in the supply chain that are critical and they just can't afford their energy bills anymore and go bust, will there be food items or drink items on the shelves in supermarkets that just won't be available?
If that were to happen, yes, there will be consequences. There will be tightening of supply in certain products, absolutely. And I think there are worries about, as I say, SMEs having a particularly hard time with this, and much of this may well be around cash flow, which is very hard for companies. So SMEs, I think also there are worries in the industry about security of supply. And I think to some of your conversation earlier, there is a sense from many of our companies that operate internationally of more planning, or at least exposure to more planning in other European countries. And so I think companies would feel reassured by a more detailed conversation with government about what happens if there is disruption to energy supplies at some point during the winter.
Energy and potential food supplies, by the sounds of it.
Well, those two things are definitely linked.
Tina McKenzie from Federation of Small Businesses. You represent lots of small businesses. We think a lot of maybe retail, hotels, coffee shops, restaurants. There's been quite a lot of stories in the media where they just can't afford to pay their energy bills. What are they going to do?
Well, I think it's interesting that 99% of all enterprises in the UK are SMEs. So the probable impact on unemployment if we don't tackle this would be huge, not just the impact on energy security and food security, but actually people losing their livelihoods, people losing their businesses that we helped keep afloat through COVID, and we're standing by now, and a lot of them are going down. Some have already closed the doors, as I'm sure you're fully aware. So for us, our latest survey shows that fuel and utilities are the two highest costs that small businesses are worried about. We know that the price increases we're seeing are anywhere between 300% and 500% for small businesses. They're probably the most vulnerable because they don't have the consumer price cap. They don't have big businesses' ability to hedge, negotiate, all of those things. So they're really, I guess, standing alone, and that's how they feel at the moment with it. Now, a lot of small businesses renegotiate, and October tends to be a time when a lot of contracts come to an end, and I think a lot of people are holding back, thinking that someone somewhere in the government may have heard the cries for help and may actually do something before the renegotiation of contracts. But it's pretty dire, and I have to say, in the context of we've got the highest producer we hear a lot about inflation, but actually we've got the highest producer price inflation in 40 years, as well as the highest tax environment in 50 years, as well as the fact they've just been through COVID and spent their reserves, have nothing left in the tank, and given so much to their communities as well. I think they don't know what to do because they cannot pay 400% and 500% increase in bills. And if I can just quickly say, the hairdresser in Manchester sent us her bills sixfold than what it usually is. The small craft brewery in Essex went from £3,000 to £14,000. The sports bar in Tyne and Wear went from 32k to 135,000. It's not possible. They just can't pay the bill. And the question is, when do we close our doors, or are we going to get help with it?
You'd presumably support a price cap for business energy contracts as well.
We think there needs to be a combination of measures, not just a price cap, but certainly we'd support any sort of cap on the cost of small business so they can at least get through the winter and prepare and plan into the new year, for sure.
Dave Dalton, you represent the intensive energy users who traditionally get a bit of help anyway from the government. I think that government's consulted on extending that help. Is that making life slightly easier for your members, or is it just as dire as everyone else?
It's just as dire as with everyone else. And I think the representation here is across a broad spectrum, from a lot of SMEs, as other people have quoted, to very big corporates. A lot of the commodities that are produced within these sectors are exactly that, commodities with very little margin, and fuel price has always been a significant part of that. So in terms of affordability, as already been said, I would empathise with everything that's already been shared. But we're seeing members roll off contracts now. Some of them have contracts into the future, they're very fortunate. Others are rolling off those contracts and seeing price rises. I had one quoted this morning, 40 million last year for fuel, this year over 200 million, speculating nearer 300. With those sorts of price increases, I'm starting with something with an embedded fuel cost of maybe 20-25% of your sales price. It's untenable, but it's a lottery, unfortunately. At the moment, we really need to understand two things very, very strongly. One, the security of supply, because some of our members have continuous processes. I specifically represent the glass industry outside wearing the energy intensive users hat. And within my own industry, we have uninterruptible process. So we are critically dependent on a permanent gas supply. And educating in that area to understand the fact that if we were to reduce to, say, less than 70% of a critical fuel load, then our furnaces fail and they close down. And there is no way back. These are 30, 40, 50 million pound plus investments that would just crumble. And a lot of these, because they are essentially administrated from outside the UK, business decisions to reinvest in the UK are really, really critical. So we find ourselves in a sort of two-stage dichotomy. One, affordability, as others have said, as we roll off contract, we can't really afford to speculate at what is now typically 7 times the price. Again, in glass, our entire fuel bill for 2020 was around 212 million. It's projected this year to be around 1.3 plus billion. Our entire industry value is less than 1.5 billion, including around 30% pass-through costs that we've already managed to achieve. So, and this is echoed. I mean, I'm speaking from more knowledge of glass than I am for steel or cement or other industries. But I think the problem is we've talked here about some of the sort of specifics. The difficulty is that the vast spectrum of need has already been said. A lot of the SMEs need immediate term support and it's cash flow. A lot of the bigger corporates see that as a loan that they don't actually need. They need a policy environment under which they can plan. And I think investment decisions based on those plans are critically hung at the moment. We really can't afford to speculate. It really does feel like we're walking into a casino and the time that we walk in determines whether we come out or not. Because fundamentally, one by one, we're reaching the end of these hedges and we're just open to a marketplace where it's impossible to speculate. If we tie into a contract now, for instance, and find that the situation eases and it's a long-term contract, it's unaffordable and we can't bury those costs. So we are really in a very, very difficult situation.
And presumably, if, for example, the European Union takes a decision to support business with their energy costs, it will make many of your members uncompetitive in terms of export opportunities because your costs will be so much higher.
Already happening. I mean, we're obviously closely connected and a lot of our companies do have European bases, so we get first-hand experience of that. You look what's happening in Germany, in France, in Italy even. We don't see the same level of urgency impacting the need in the UK. And this winter is going to be absolutely critical for us. We need to make decisions, but we need some support. Our big dichotomy here is, historically, energy-intensive industries have been the pariahs. We've been the carbon emitters. But over the past 20 years, we've worked together, and more so over the last 3 or 4 years in a collaborative sense, to put roadmaps towards complete decarbonisation together. All of those things are having to go on hold because we don't have the investment capacity to keep those processes in flow. I mean, we are looking to decarbonise, but how can we do that if we can't fuel switch, if we can't experiment or invest? And at the moment, the speculation is so high, it's all about survival.
Okay, thank you. Paul Howell, please.
Thank you, Chair. A little bit of what I was going to raise has been covered, because what I wanted to start talking about was the relative level of price increases. And I know, Tina, you've given us a sense of yours. Dave, you've given us a sense of yours. I want to come back, Karen, and ask you whether you can give me a sense of the scale of what's going on there. My past life, I spent a bit of time in the cement industry, so I know the significance there, and I've spent a lot of time in a medium-sized manufacturing company, so I'm used to dealing with the need for forward contracts and all of this sort of thing, and the wall that comes when you step from one to another. So I do have a context as to where you're at, but could you just talk a little bit, Karen, in terms of what you're seeing in terms of the input challenges that you're getting?
Yeah, I mean, I think you will have seen that, as I say, food and drink price inflation rose to 12.7% in July. I think it was 9.8% in June. So it's rising fast, and as I say,
sorry, just to be specific, that's the inflation you're seeing in the food and drink. But I'm wondering what your input costs are driven by energy. Your input inflation, if you like.
So, I mean, a significant proportion of our input costs are driven by energy, but some of the increases in costs that you see in inputs are, so for instance, if we buy glass, to the last conversation, the price of the glass will have gone up, and that is, so to us it's the price of glass that's gone up, but it's the price of energy into the production of that glass that is driving the price. So energy probably is a baseline for the rising costs altogether, but you will have seen, significant price rises in the price of ingredients and global commodities, and that is significant for our industry as well. So at the moment, domestic ingredient inflation is running at about 15%, and imported ingredient inflation is running at about 22%. And that is driven by a variety of factors, but it includes things like the global price of wheat, the global price of dairy, things like the drought that we've experienced in the UK and in other European countries, having pushed up the need for and the cost of animal feed. So there is a variety of different global factors which are in some way driven by energy that are all finding their way into the rising costs of food and drink.
Yeah, it's not just the obvious ones that are there, it comes through the supply chain in many ways. Yeah, I get that. Tina, is there anything you want to add to that? I mean, I see, as we all do as MPs when we talk about our constituents, everything from the small steel company that's in fabrication work that has troubles through to somebody who's running a climbing wall and the electric costs that go with it. They can just about send them out of business and close them down. But is there anything else you want to add in terms of the scale of what you're seeing, or the ability to get new contracts, or anything from the range of businesses that you come across?
I think what we're seeing is a real shock across the business community as these bills come in, because we've heard a lot over the summer about consumer bills and people starting to realise, even the cost of fuel for their vehicles and things like that. And we've heard that from some of the people that are out on the road, some of the small businesses that are members that have vehicles. But the absolute shock that these bills are landing, electricity and gas, and that someone somewhere expects a small business that maybe turns over less than 40,000, 50,000 a year to pay a bill that might be 10,000, 15,000, which is more than the gross profit, never mind the profit. And I think because they're all in the same boat, I mean, we're hearing it from 89% of our members have cited it as an issue and the biggest issue. I think people are in so much shock. There isn't when we talk about the issues with the labour market, and we talk about some of the fixes we can do on that over the next 6, 12, 18 months, over a number of years. This is something that, we talk about interest rate increases, which, have an impact on small businesses. But again, you're going through a period of having to adjust to it. These particular bills landing are things that are landing, and there's absolutely no answer. They do not have the cash to pay the bill, and they're not the type of people. Most small businesses in this country do not have offshore accounts. They're paying their tax. They're good people. They're giving back to their communities, and therefore they don't have anywhere else to go. They look at it and think, where am I meant to get that cash to pay that bill? And that's why there's just a collective shock, and that's why it's such a crisis, because they don't know what to do. And the only thing they can think of, because they know it's tough to get lending at the moment when we talk to them about lending, the only thing they can think is that it? Is it time to close the door? Now, effectively, you're talking about over 16 million people employed. You're talking about over 50% of the GDP of the United Kingdom. You know, you're talking about the high streets being decimated. You're talking about the economy seriously quite quickly without, you know, making it sound worse than it is. This is absolutely the most serious thing we've seen. And we've been through COVID and we've been through other recessions. This to us is unless we act. And I think for the companies, the utility companies, quite frankly, they know the companies can't pay these bills. They know that. So the question really is, where do they think they're getting it from?
And I'll come across and develop the question further in a second, but just one more specific on that. We also hear about the actual difficulty to get a new account as well. Actually, the difficulty to get a new account, the demand for a prepayment. You know, yes, if you want to come to us, but we need 10 grand off you before we even going to entertain you.
You know, it's
your experience. Do you get much feedback
yes.
in that space as well?
Well, a lot of our small businesses, a lot of our members have said that the companies they were with have gone under. And you'll find it was the smaller utility companies that had the smaller businesses in contract. And so they were kind of left high and dry when these companies went under. So that was the first impact. I think secondly, a bit like some of the small businesses that are being refused these days to have bank accounts, you know, they're also being refused certain utility contracts. So yes, we're hearing that, but more so the impact of the smaller ones that closed. And again, just left some of those small businesses out searching for new contracts, and what they got back was 4 or 5 times what they normally pay.
Yeah, and I'm hearing it from many customers.
Yeah.
Well, could I add
Karen, before I go
just a couple of things that I also should have mentioned. First is labour. And as your previous panel noted, we're in the peculiar situation of having a very tight labour market in the current economic climate. So the cost of labour in our industry is going up, and that is feeding into food and drink price inflation. And the other thing I would mention is exchange rates. You know, the UK imports about 60% of the food consumed in the UK. We produce about 40% domestically. And so quite a lot of not finished products actually, and often ingredients are being imported from overseas. And there is a real hidden impact of exchange rates. Those goods are costing significantly more to buy than they were a year ago.
Thank you. I think the questions are obvious next, aren't they, in terms of you know, how many suppliers are not taking on new business customers, and how many are demanding upfront payments? What do you?
I feel like there are a number of questions coming from the previous points. I think there's a real agreement that urgency is key here. As has been noted, a number of non-domestic customers are facing increasing bills, and as we get closer to the colder weather, and also this is a time of year where lots of contracts come up for renegotiations. That's absolutely right. I think that one thing that's clear to us is that our members are speaking to their non-domestic customers pretty much every day, and they are doing their best to support them, but the current situation does feel like it's out of control of the industry, and government needs to intervene. A few things you sort of alluded to.
As part of your answer, could you just elaborate on why we're seeing you know, demand for deposits and things like this up front as well, please?
Yes, sorry, I was coming on to that. So I think one thing that's important to note is that when you're offering a contract to a non-domestic customer, a supplier will hedge a certain price over a number of years, and for obvious reasons, you know, to spread the cost and any spikes in winter over years, and that gives them the ability to offer low prices to customers and means that cash flow remains constant for energy suppliers. But non-domestic customers are not a homogeneous group. They vary greatly, as has been set out, and they can vary from anything from a few tens of thousands of pounds to millions and millions, and it's very difficult right now to hedge that far in advance in order to offer those long-term contracts, and nor do many business customers want those based on today's prices. So prices are incredibly high, because of the difference in the risk profile, I think, is the best way of describing it, in that the energy companies have to consider and assess the risk of their potential business customer and what it means to them in terms of potential for future debt. So one of our energy supplier members has recently told us that the level of debt amongst their non-domestic customer base has pretty much doubled in the last year. So that's the sort of thing they're seeing. So they're very, very mindful of that, and that's why it's so difficult to offer contracts right now. because businesses have different risk profiles.
Do you think there's a sense of being overly cautious in that space, though, by the amount of deposits that are being demanded?
I think that they're basing it on their assessment of the risk and their ability to ensure that they can get the money back that they are paying for the commodity. The commodity is incredibly expensive because of global gas prices, and it's the point about the long-term hedge, and that gives them the ability to give businesses the stability they need. It's a far from perfect situation, and I think that's why government does need to intervene. I do think there are a few things government should be considering, including cutting VAT from non-domestic bills from 20% to at least 5%, which would mirror that in the domestic market. I think government should also be thinking about, we've mentioned COVID and the impact on businesses and the economy. I think that we should be thinking about funding some of the wholesale cost shock for energy for business customers through things like energy grants for businesses. I also think that, and it struck me that this wasn't brought up in the earlier session as well, but very little discussion about energy efficiency. And I was glad to hear Dave talk about the journey on decarbonisation as well. I do think we need to be thinking about how we can help businesses to reduce their energy consumption as well, where those savings could be made in the long term. And I know that's not something that will solve prices for this winter, but it is something we should be thinking about.
It's another tool in the bag. I'll leave it at that, Chair. I could talk for a while.
Thank you. I'm going to Andy McDonald.
Thanks, Chair. Just on the theme, can we have a little discussion about the role of Ofgem in all of this? Because the question arises, how well are Ofgem protecting non-domestic customers, and what actions are you looking to Ofgem to take to protect commercial customers, and have they got the powers? Have they got the powers to do it? What's the view? I don't know if anybody would like to come in.
I'm happy to start if it's helpful. I think that when it comes to Ofgem's role right now in the crisis for both domestic and non-domestic customers, this is about price, and this is about that global price, and therefore most of the solutions and interventions to support customers, both households and businesses, need to be driven by government. I genuinely do think that this is about price, and that's what the issue is here right now. Right. I do think, though, one thing that we haven't touched on, and I know that you probably don't want to go into detail on, is that role of TPIs. Government has committed to regulating that sector. We talked about how many small businesses were on contracts with some of those smaller energy suppliers that went out of business. I think there's a big role for TPI regulation in this space, particularly for SMEs.
Third-party intermediaries.
This is the brokers. I'm sorry, I should have spelled
it
out.
That's right. Yeah. I get that. We have actually looked at third-party brokers in the past, but you rightly raise it. I wonder if Dave wants to come in on the role of Ofgem or their lack of activity.
Yes, I don't think it's a secret that as the energy intensive user group, we've never really been a great fan of the powers that Ofgem managed to wield to assist us in industry. As a regulator, they don't really appear to have been able to influence policy from a government perspective to accommodate our needs, and I think a lot of this has been around domestic rather than industrial use. So jury's been out for us. We've had a much stronger dialogue because of the degree of concern that exists at the moment. But I think it's not just Ofgem. We have tried a more sort of tripartite dialogue with National Grid as well, who are providing into the potential solutions to this, because obviously, yes, as has already been said, we do need government intervention. We need a better understanding. We need creation of that policy environment. We need easement of certain situations in the immediate term. But EIUG have always campaigned to get fair and equitable supply to the UK so that we can compete. That won't change. The real issue is the immediacy, the here and now. What gets us over this winter? What sort of interventions can we do? Just going back to the previous comments, there are less suppliers in the industrial supply market currently. A lot of them have closed down, as already been said. There's no profit to be had at that level. So that's making that element of purchasing more and more speculative. It means that we're having to go to potentially new suppliers with no experience. And of course, they are asking for guarantees, payments up front. the sorts of volumes that we consume, that becomes a real issue to us. But going back to the sort of tripartite element of it, there's a demand side response element here that comes really out of the sort of national grid position. What we are concerned about is an understanding of our industries. We really do feel that with a much more constructive dialogue, rather than having to be reactive, and quite frankly, that's where most of our members sit at the moment in terms of reacting to process that they don't understand. If we could be more proactive and work on the ability that, given enough notice, there are elements of the energy intensive sector that could actually reduce their load. Mine's not one of them. In glass, we have to produce once we've turned the furnace on 24/7. But we could switch fuels, and in switching fuels, we need the ability for regulators, for instance, to be able to accommodate, at least pro tem, our stretching of our contracts in terms of emissions limits, things like that, to be able to get by. Survival comes first in this equation. I think the dialogue across Ofgem, national grid and industry supported by government needs to be one that's much more constructive. I do believe in this arena that by playing that one through, industries like mine could switch to other alternative fuel sources, maybe heavy fuel oil as the sort of last fraction that no one particularly wants. We could survive on that, but we'd need some easement of our emissions capabilities to get through it. Some other sectors in energy intensive could actually turn down their production or even turn it off for a while if it's incentivized. So demand side response is not something where, as we have it currently, given 6 hours notice, could we cope? It's something that says, plan for the winter. What could you do? When can you actually switch on of an evening rather than during the day? What other fuels could you use? What easements could government put in place to see us through that? And our intention there would be to work through that to help make sure that domestic users are not left short of gas supply or electricity supply during this winter. But we need a much firmer and proactive dialogue if that's going to be a reality.
Thank you. Alan Brown, please.
Thanks, Chair. Dhara, if we just return briefly to domestic customers. Now, when your members are asking for government support for customers, they're also effectively asking for support for themselves because it protects them in terms of bad debt. So, if the government does announce greater measures this week, would your members support the call from Citizen Advice in terms of a ban on moving domestic customers onto prepayment meters this winter? Because we know prepayment meters have got higher standing charges, and clearly a small amount of debt means they're cut off effectively until they can top up their meters. So sure, as a quid pro quo, your members could support that.
That's not a specific thing that we have talked in detail with members about. What I would say is that, and I know Citizens Advice would agree with this, in that before this gas price crisis, certainly prepayment meter users more often than not, and again I'm not talking about people who are being moved on now, I'm talking about in legacy, tend to like it as a budgeting tool. So there is, I think, a balancing act here in terms of how we support these people. Our members are incredibly concerned about prepayment meter customers. We have a vulnerability commitment which covers around 70 to 80% of the market. And one of the things we do as part of that is to track people who are self-disconnecting and proactively reach out and offer that help and support. So there are things that are being done to help support and cushion the blow for people on prepayment meter. I understand the ask and I understand why it's being asked. I think that there's a real balancing act here. What we do know is that we are seeing levels of bad debt increase already. We're also seeing huge demand for customer service from all types of customers, regardless of payment type. With I think some members saying are seeing at least over 50% increase in calls during summer when you really wouldn't expect that sort of thing. So I think the point about people who are struggling now is absolutely right, and that it will get worse this winter. I think the question around prepayment meter is one that we need to look at in some more detail.
Some can come back to committee on.
We'll talk about it with members and come back to you.
Okay. In terms of security of supply overall, as I come into winter, just how secure is predicted energy supply, and is rationing a possibility?
I think that the best thing for me to point to is the National Grid Winter Outlook, where the verdict is sort of based on normal circumstances this winter. However, I think it would be really remiss of me to not also point out that we are going through some extraordinary times right now, and government should be planning for every scenario, including worst case scenario. I think it's, even if we are confident that we're okay for supply, it could well come at a very high cost. And so some of the points Dave made about the potential for turning down energy intensive users or using energy different are incredibly pertinent. I think, again, coming back to the demand reduction and energy efficiency points, we really ought to be having some serious, significant conversations about demand reduction, both at grid scale and in individual households too. To your point about security of supply, I think the main thing is to be really honest about the fact that customer support and security of supply are two sides of the same coin, really, and that we need to be thinking about demand side reduction, energy efficiency, as well as that kind of support for people this winter.
So what is a realistic worst case scenario?
I think it depends on what happens with, I don't have the crystal ball, but I think it does depend on what happens with Russia and the different ways that we import gas in this country. Our households are, 80% of households are reliant on gas for heating, and we burn 40% of gas to create electricity. So I think that we ought to be thinking about the worst case scenario, although I think it's important to not scaremonger, and I think it's really important to also reassure people that Grid's Winter Outlook verdict is based on normal circumstances, I think is the language they use.
Looking at energy security, we know in the short term, doesn't matter your view on nuclear can't provide short-term security. Hinkley Point C is going to be at least 4 years late before Unit 1 comes on. Sizewell, if it gets a go-ahead, at best will be 10 to 15 years. But yet the outgoing Prime Minister this morning in his valedictory speech still spoke about building a new nuclear reactor every year. That's just a fallacy, because we can't actually build a nuclear reactor every year. Would that be right? Saying no matter your views on...
I don't think anyone in the industry has said that you could build a new nuclear reactor every year, but I do think it's important we invest in a strong generation mix, and I think that we don't do anything. I think government shouldn't take any steps that would curtail investment. Energy generation, electricity generation has a really long-term investment horizon, and we need to be thinking about that really quite significantly. In any steps taken to support and alleviate the pain for this winter shouldn't take the eye off the ball for the long term.
Can I ask Karen, depending on how things go, will your members have to think about self-rationing as well as we go into winter? Is that a serious issue?
I think that, as I said earlier, the energy crisis is impacting different businesses in different way. It depends how big you are, how you can negotiate, your power with vis-a-vis negotiating with your supplier. It depends how much energy you use to make certain products. But yes, I think for some companies, and as I said earlier, that particularly SMEs under pressure, they may get into a situation of self-rationing. And I think that's why the conversation that has been had just now about efficiencies and continuing to invest in a secure energy mix is really important. I mean, most of our companies will have been looking to efficiencies for some time now as they've seen gas prices going up. Everybody will be trying to limit the energy that they are using in some way. But I think there is more that government can do to help businesses do that and to make sure that companies are able to continue to invest in the green transition. So, for instance, the BEIS consultation at the moment about the climate change agreements would actually exclude 85% of our sector from the current climate change agreement that they benefit from. And that seems a bit of a perverse outcome at the moment, when we need to be finding incentives, particularly for a sector as diverse as ours, that involves as many smaller businesses and low margin businesses as it does, to make sure that people can continue to manage their own energy as well as possible. And on that, I would say that at the moment our industry is struggling, I would say, to absorb the level of regulation that's coming at us the levels of new government regulation on things like plastics and packaging, where we know that we have got to get to good outcomes and we know we've got to get there quickly. But at the moment, well, I think we need a bit of a review of what the priorities are here and a bit more support for those investments that need to be made in the green transition, and perhaps a bit more listening to industry on how progress on things like plastics and packaging can be made in a more efficient and streamlined way than is currently envisaged by government.
David, can I quickly ask, just in terms of supply disruption, you've already said that for furnaces, disruption in supply or not enough energy would be catastrophic. Dhara spoke about reducing demand side on energy intensive industries. Is there enough discussions with your sector in terms of what security supply would look like and what protections need to be in place?
Is there ever enough discussion? It's live, to be fair. We are permanently in touch with the relevant civil servants. The evidence and the models have been put together. It's really the sort of judgment call on what action comes from that. There is a massive exposure and vulnerability. There's absolutely no doubt. We are in such uncertain times that unless we have something we can hang our hat on and know definitively how things are going to play out, then we're speculating. At the moment, I've got companies looking to vary their fuel mix. In doing so, they are then flying in the face of hedge contracts they already have that will be coming to an end, or placing new hedge contracts. It's all speculation that we can't afford to take on board, and the exposure is absolutely immense. Our vulnerability at the moment, as others have said, is such a varied lot. We represent a lot of SMEs, particularly in the ceramics sector. I think in the Ceramics Federation, there's probably 90 some members. 95% of those get no relief. They are SMEs. They're in a really exposed position. If you go to some of the more consolidated larger sectors like steel and chemicals, then some of that relief is already taking place, and it's a slightly better situation in one aspect of where they currently stand. But in the round, the mix exposes all of us, big or small, massively energy intensive or electro intensive. I think the rules having changed, and as I said earlier, we are looking to extend that dialogue progressively. It's not the immediate term stuff here. This is getting the whole longer term policy landscape correct. Carbon floor price, some of the embedded elements that we are still paying that are now moribund. We need to get all of that sorted out. We're on a journey to net zero. We need supporting on that journey, but we can't afford to let members fall away, because we're actually setting the trend for the rest of the world, collaborating on these issues towards roadmap journeys to net zero with industries, sectors fully signed up to it. We've got subscribers from elsewhere on the planet looking at UK, looking at the trend that we're setting. At the moment, we're putting all of that on hold, and we're seeing companies just about to fall away. We saw the debacle with CF fertilizers earlier in the year, the lack of CO2 in the marketplace, impacting on food and beverage. A plant's already closed down. The current position is there's going to be a suspension in production, which is going to rapidly and massively impact on food production. We look at things like paper manufacture, responsible for most things that are shipped around, carton board. The last company producing paper for banknotes in the UK, in Hampshire, closed down with the loss of 300 jobs a fortnight ago. These things are happening already. We are just in such an exposed position. The dialogue is there. The outcomes from the dialogue are wanting. We need action, not just dialogue. And that's where we stand at the moment.
Can you just very briefly, what's the timescales of actions needed to get that certainty?
Yes, yesterday.
Thank you. Mark Pawsey, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I've just got a quick question for Karen. In addition to saying to Karen, you've got some very big boots to fill. I'm sure you've heard that many times already. You spoke about food price inflation of 12.7% in July. How long is it going to last for, and what are your projections for the next 12 months?
I'm not a forecaster, but with everything that our companies are saying, food inflation is unlikely to peak until well into next year, and it may run into...
The energy hit only hits once, doesn't it? The depreciation that we've seen over the last few months only hits once. So can we look forward to something more stable in the new year?
Well, inflation is going to start to slow down because it's going to be, our figures are going to be off a higher base come the autumn, winter. But I think we are still going to have food and drink price inflation for some time. And that's because, there is some drop-off in global commodity prices that have come through the UN FAO figures recently. But our producers will say it takes between 4 and 6 months for them to start experiencing, for instance, a slightly lower wheat price. It then takes between 7 and 12 months for the prices that manufacturers are paying to be reflected in the prices that customers see on supermarket shelves. So there is quite an inbuilt time lag into food and drink price inflation anyway, and you've got the volatility of energy added into that. So I think it is going to take some time for this to work through the system.
Okay, and a quick one for Tina as well, if I may. I don't know if you heard the previous evidence session, but Joanne Cairns of Usdaw, in arguing the case for wage increases to get somewhere close to the rate of inflation, told us that there were rising profits in a number of companies. She did say, to be fair, a number of companies, but how big would you put that number?
Goodness, that's a really good question, and it depends where they're putting their profits to really know what their numbers are. If we're talking about some of the big companies in this country, I'd say that what we've seen in terms of the increase in wages in the private sector, they have gone up. The average wages are well above, and most companies we're dealing with, they are above the minimum wage. But what we're actually finding is that there's kind of a bit of a pushback on that now, because people want to work with people that they enjoy working with. They want to work close to home. They want to work in certain environments. So it's not just all about the wage, and if they can get £1 or £2 somewhere else more an hour. Now this kind of crisis puts everybody kind of on edge in terms of getting more money and pushing for money. But ultimately, especially with your smaller businesses, the employees know that a lot of the times that owner is going home on a Friday night and the only person not paid is her or him. And and they've got some sympathy for that. Equally, they also know, and there's a real kind of understanding across the country today, I'd say, that unemployment could flip very quickly. So we're seeing less movement for a few.
In terms of profitability, we've heard about the cost inputs that businesses are facing. Are they able to pass those prices on, or are profits getting squeezed to the extent that some businesses are now not profitable?
If you imagine, if you add up all the extra costs in terms of the supply chain costs, never mind the cost of delays, as well as the tax costs, increased national insurance, and all the other costs we're seeing with the utility bills, fuel, etc., then there is no way you could walk into a coffee shop and charge somebody 20 quid for a cup of coffee in this country. So margins are being squeezed.
Right. How many businesses have got a rainy day fund? Does that not exist because of the COVID pandemic that they've gone through over the past few years? Or are there some businesses? I met a small business in my constituency recently facing massive increase in energy costs, but they've been trading for 20 or 30 years. They will see this period through. How many businesses are not going to be able to manage to do that?
Well, we don't know for sure. And you won't know until after it's happened, because the fact of the matter is we didn't think we would lose nearly 10% of the businesses in the UK, 400,000 in 2020. We found out 12, 14 months later when the statistics come through. But anecdotally, what we're seeing is a lot of, and you'll see it, you'll get the letters in, I'm sure, in your in-tray. We're seeing it on social media. We're seeing it with our members, 150,000 members who are telling us that they're either closing the doors, they're downsizing, they're letting people go, they're doing other things to manage it. There is not huge big profits out there to carry them through. They just don't have that availability or that access to cash.
Okay, and we heard from Dave earlier some specific asks. Can I put to each of you, as three people in the room, if the new Prime Minister was sitting in this chair here and you got three asks of her that she can do immediately, what are they?
Number one, take 200,000 small businesses, the smallest businesses in this country, out of a tax that is really unfair, and that is that their rates. They are the smallest businesses. If you bring the threshold to 25,000, it takes 200,000 small businesses out. Right. Number two, put an energy cap on right away, immediately. Let them get through the winter, and let's look at it again next year, and do it at least till the end of March, like Germany's done. Don't do it for a quarter. And I think finally, fuel duty, cut duty on fuel. That will really help a lot of businesses.
Karen, your three things.
So first of all, a credible package of support for households will help the whole economy and it will help our businesses. Secondly, we need a serious conversation with the government about what support is appropriate to the food and drink manufacturing sector to get through this crisis, to make sure that we don't have
a snappy, quick
food security
that you're going to say to her.
Thank you.
It's an elevator pitch.
Number three is about government needs to look very carefully at the current cost of regulation. Government thinks it has no power
to influence red tape.
Prices, but yes, absolutely, there is much more red tape that we need than we need. And government needs to get better at listening to the business community when we say that regulation can be achieved in better and more efficient ways.
The government listens to FSB pretty well, and CBI and others lobby effectively on our Food and Drink Federation. And Dhara, what three asks have you got of the new Prime Minister sitting in this chair here?
I think I've gone through the ones on non-domestic, but I will echo them. They're cut VAT, fund some of the wholesale cost shock through reducing things like business rates or emergency energy grants, those sorts of things, extending loans. I do think we should be thinking about long-term investment in energy efficiency. For households, I think it's really, really important that we crack on now to do something in the short term for this winter, as well as think about long-term and next winter. This is not a problem that's going to go away in 6 months'
time. Thank you, Chair.
Does Dave get a go?
Dave gave us loads, I think, actually. But Dave, if you want to just reiterate those.
Number one, to follow the lead of other EU countries in providing emergency financial help to energy intensives. To work with Ofgem National Grid to develop an industrial demand side response product that actually works. And then three, the Environment Agency to be a little bit more tolerant and put some temporary easement in place to allow us to maybe temporarily switch fuels to get us over this particular hump.
Okay, thanks, Dave.
Great. Thank you, everybody. It's reported by Bloomberg that there's been another leak from the government about support coming for business this week with a price cap on commercial energy bills, no doubt because of the pressure bearing down on government from the committee hearing this morning. So we'll look forward to seeing that detail on Thursday. It's clear that businesses need help as well as consumers, and that the scale of the energy crisis is driving lots of other economic pressures. And so the new Prime Minister, who I understand, well, I think she might now be the new Prime Minister, will hopefully bear that in mind with the announcements that we expect later this week. So thank you to all four of you for your contributions. That brings today's session to an end. Order, order.